America was already using his work before it ever learned his name. In the early 1840s, along the humid lowlands of the American South, something unusual began to happen. Roads stopped flooding where they always had. Water systems began holding longer. Industrial foundations, once prone to collapse, stood firm through seasons that had destroyed earlier attempts. No newspapers praised the architect. No plaques marked the design. No ledger recorded the mind behind the calculations. Because the man who solved these problems was enslaved. They called him Isaac Brown, but only when they had to. Most days, he was simply referred to as the one who figures things out. He lived on a plantation outside Galveston, a port city swelling with trade, cotton, and quiet violence. Galveston was growing fast, faster than its infrastructure could handle. Floodwaters crept into warehouses, foundations cracked under weight they were never designed to carry. Plantation owners complained, engineers failed, white contractors argued, and then, almost by accident, someone asked a slave. Isaac had been repairing broken tools when he quietly pointed out that the slope of a drainage trench was wrong. Not bad, wrong. He explained it using pebbles and a stick, drawing angles in the dirt no one had taught him to draw. The trench was corrected. It worked. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning of something America would later pretend never happened. Isaac Brown had never attended school. Teaching enslaved people to read or write was illegal in much of the South by the 1830s. In Texas, it was quietly enforced. Violence did the rest. And yet Isaac understood numbers, not memorized numbers, not repeated ones. He understood relationships between them, lengths, loads, pressure, flow. As a boy, he had been assigned to carry materials, timbers, stone, iron fittings, back and forth between construction sites near the port. While other boys watched the overseer, Isaac watched the structures. He noticed patterns, why certain beams cracked, why others didn't, why water destroyed one foundation and spared another only yards away. At night, he recreated these problems in the dirt behind his quarters. He used string pulled from feed sacks to measure distance. He stacked stones to test weight distribution. When something collapsed, he rebuilt it differently. He never called it engineering. He called it understanding why things failed. Years later, when a white engineer from Louisiana arrived to inspect a failing canal wall, Isaac was ordered to carry his instruments. Halfway through the inspection, the engineer muttered that the design made no sense. Isaac answered before he could stop himself. "You're fighting the water instead of letting it pass." Silence followed. Not thoughtful silence, dangerous silence. The engineer turned slowly. Isaac expected punishment, a whip, a beating, being sold south. Instead, the man asked a question, then another, then another. By sunset, Isaac had corrected the canal plan using nothing but charcoal and a flattened crateboard. The wall was rebuilt. It held. From that day on, Isaac was quietly pulled from field labor and assigned to projects. Never officially, never on paper, always through intermediaries. He worked on drainage systems feeding Galveston warehouses, load calculations for industrial mills, reinforced foundations for docks that would later move millions of dollars in goods. His designs were used by men who would later testify before state commissions. Those men were praised. Isaac was never mentioned. By 1845, the year Texas joined the United States, infrastructure in key regions was improving at an unnatural pace. Roads held, flooding reduced, industrial output stabilized. No one asked why, because the explanation would have shattered the story America was telling itself. A nation built by free men could not admit it was leaning on the mind of someone it legally owned. And Isaac was starting to understand something else too. The more valuable his mind became, the more dangerous his existence was. By the late 1840s, Isaac Brown's work had begun to move faster than he ever could. Not on paper, not under his name, but through conversations. White engineers came and went through Galveston, men working on ports, rail corridors, mills, and water systems expanding across the South. Some stayed days, some stayed weeks. Nearly all of them noticed the same thing. Problems they had struggled with elsewhere were already solved here. They asked who designed it. The answers were always vague. A local method, plantation experience, trial and error. And when pressed further, they were introduced to Isaac, not as a designer, not as an engineer, but as labor assistants, someone who had a feel for structures. Isaac learned to speak carefully. He never offered full solutions anymore, only fragments, a slope correction here, a load adjustment there, a quiet warning that something would fail if left unchanged. Those fragments were enough. Engineers carried them north and east to river towns, rail depots, industrial yards. They incorporated the ideas into their own plans, improved them, claimed them. By the time similar systems appeared along the Mississippi River, no one remembered where the thinking had started, only that it worked. Isaac never left Texas, but his mind already had. In 1851, something happened that frightened even the men who benefited from Isaac's intelligence. A ledger surfaced. It was kept by a shipping contractor out of New Orleans, a man meticulous enough to record changes in structural performance alongside cost. What the ledger showed was strange. Across multiple states, unrelated projects, canals, docks, rail foundations had begun showing identical design logic. The same ratios, the same spacing patterns, the same drainage principles. Different engineers, different companies, same mind. The contractor called it coincidence at first, then he mapped it. When the projects were plotted geographically, the trail curved back again and again toward coastal Texas, toward Galveston, toward one plantation. The ledger was never published. It disappeared after a meeting involving investors, local officials, and one man who would later become a state infrastructure advisor. Because if the pattern was real, it meant something unthinkable. That one enslaved man had influenced a significant portion of America's early industrial lifelines. And that meant those lifelines rested on a contradiction the country was not ready to face. Isaac began to notice the change before anyone warned him. He was watched more closely, asked fewer questions, given orders not to speak during inspections. At first, he thought this meant he had made a mistake. Then an overseer said something that revealed the truth. "You don't need to understand so much anymore," the man muttered. "We've got it from here." That was the danger. They had learned enough. Isaac's usefulness was shifting from source to risk. In a system built on ownership, an enslaved man who could not be replaced was a problem. An enslaved man whose ideas could spread without him was worse. And an enslaved man who understood his own value, that was intolerable. By the early 1850s, Isaac was quietly removed from all visible projects. His work was filtered through intermediaries. His access to sites was reduced, his movements restricted. Not punished, contained. Because killing him would raise questions. Selling him would spread the problem. So they chose the safest option, to let him disappear slowly while continuing to use what he had already given them. Isaac understood this before anyone said it aloud, and he began doing something no one expected. He started keeping track. Isaac Brown had learned long ago that memory was not enough. Structures failed when people forgot why they were built the way they were, and people, especially powerful ones, forgot conveniently. So he began recording, not in words, in patterns. On scraps of wood, he carved sequences of marks, spacing, depth, angle, encoded in a way only someone who understood load and flow could interpret. He tied knots into string bundles, each knot representing ratios used in foundations and water systems. He etched lines into stone near work sites, shallow enough to pass as damage, precise enough to be read later. These were not plans, they were proof of thought. If anyone ever asked where the ideas came from, Isaac wanted the answer to exist somewhere beyond his body. By 1854, whispers of unrest were moving through Texas. National arguments over slavery had intensified after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and engineers began preparing for expansion, not peace. Rail corridors, military supply routes, fortified depots. And once again, the solutions they used followed Isaac's logic. But this time, something changed. One engineer, young, ambitious, and careless, asked the wrong question. "Who taught him?" he said aloud during an inspection. No one answered. That silence was louder than any confession. By 1861, the country broke open. The American Civil War turned infrastructure into a weapon. Roads determined troop movement, rail systems decided supply lines, water access defined survival. And many of those systems, especially in the South, were built on principles Isaac had shaped years earlier. He was brought back into work quietly, not openly, not officially, but urgently. Military engineers needed calculations, fast ones, reliable ones, ones that wouldn't fail under pressure. Isaac provided them. He worked nights, he worked unseen. He was moved between sites under guard, told nothing of strategy, shown only problems to solve. And he noticed something chilling. His designs were being used to control, not connect. Canals redirected water away from civilian areas. Rail spurs were optimized for troop movement, not trade. Foundations reinforced sites that would later become holding zones and depots. The lifelines he once believed would sustain communities were now feeding a machine of destruction. Isaac understood then that history would not just erase his name, it would weaponize his mind. In 1863, Isaac Brown vanished. No sale record, no death notice, no burial site. Plantation logs listed him as reassigned. Military records made no mention of him. Engineers who had relied on him suddenly claimed full authorship of their work. The war swallowed explanations. Some said he was sent inland to work on fortifications near Vicksburg. Others claimed he died of illness. A few whispered that he had been executed after refusing to cooperate further. But one detail never changed. After his disappearance, mistakes began appearing. Drainage systems failed where they never had before. Foundations cracked under loads Isaac would have adjusted for. Rail grades eroded faster than expected. The systems still worked, just not as well. As if the mind that truly understood them was no longer present to correct their course. And somewhere, possibly buried, possibly destroyed, were the records Isaac had made. Or so everyone believed. When the war ended, America rushed to rebuild without asking what it had destroyed. During Reconstruction era, engineers fanned out across the South to repair canals, docks, railbeds, and industrial foundations damaged by neglect or sabotage. Many of them encountered the same strange detail at different sites. Marks. Not graffiti, not damage. Intentional lines cut into stone at precise intervals. Shallow grooves etched into timber supports. Knot clusters tied into old cordage buried near foundations. Most dismissed them as meaningless. One engineer did not. In Savannah, A reconstruction supervisor noticed that adjusting a canal wall to match the spacing of those marks stopped a recurring collapse problem. He wrote a brief note in his journal, calling it an inherited method. He never asked who inherited it from. Similar discoveries appeared in Mobile and along Gulf ports. Engineers corrected old structures by following the marks, and the fixes worked. The marks were never cataloged, they were simply used, just as Isaac's thinking always had been. By the 1880s, American engineering journals began publishing articles on regional structural intuition. They described drainage gradients common to the Gulf South, load distribution methods used in older docks, canal designs that resisted erosion unusually well. None cited an origin. Instead, they attributed the methods to local experience or anonymous labor knowledge. This was acceptable to everyone. Naming a single source would invite a dangerous question. How did enslaved labor develop advanced engineering logic without formal education? The silence protected reputations. It protected institutions. It protected a national myth. And yet, something about the techniques bothered younger engineers. The logic was too consistent, too intentional, as if it had come from one mind or a tightly held system of thought. In St. Louis, a professor reportedly told his students, "These methods feel authored." He never published that opinion. Authorship would require an author, and no one wanted to search for him. Modern historians still debate Isaac Brown's existence. Some argue he was a composite figure, an idea retroactively assigned to explain patterns that make people uncomfortable. Others insist plantation records and secondary accounts point to a real individual whose influence was deliberately fragmented. But here is what cannot be dismissed. The systems that shaped America's early industrial lifelines did not emerge randomly. They followed logic. They followed correction. They followed understanding. And that understanding appeared in places where education was denied, where credit was illegal, and where ownership replaced acknowledgement. If Isaac Brown was erased, it was not because he failed. It was because he succeeded too well. His disappearance solved a problem. His ideas lived on without him. And America learned, quietly, that it could benefit from brilliance while denying the humanity behind it. That lesson did not end with slavery. It simply became harder to see. By the early 20th century, Isaac Brown's name, when it appeared at all, was buried in footnotes, local rumors, and disputed plantation records. But something larger had begun to trouble historians who were willing to look closer. Isaac was not alone. Across America's industrial rise, there were gaps, moments where progress jumped forward without clear authorship. Bridges that outperformed expectations, water systems that lasted decades longer than predicted, rail foundations that resisted erosion in regions where failure was assumed. These advancements were often credited to practical labor knowledge. That phrase appeared again and again. It sounded harmless, neutral, technical. It was neither. Practical labor knowledge became a convenient label for intelligence that could not be publicly acknowledged because of who possessed it: enslaved people, black workers, indigenous laborers, immigrants without status. Infrastructure absorbed their thinking the way soil absorbs water, quietly, permanently, without attribution. Isaac Brown was disturbing not because he was exceptional, but because he was traceable. And traceability threatened the illusion that innovation had only one face. There is a reason Isaac's story survived in fragments instead of monuments. Infrastructure does not invite questions. People ask who built a cathedral. They ask who painted a masterpiece. They ask who wrote a book. They do not ask who calculated the slope of a drainage system. They walk on roads without wondering whose mind decided they would not flood. They drink water without asking who understood pressure and flow before the math was formalized. They trust structures precisely because they feel anonymous. That anonymity is powerful. It allows genius to be extracted without confrontation. It allows systems to benefit from minds they refuse to honor. It allows history to function without accountability. Isaac's ideas became invisible because they worked too well. Failure demands explanation. Success disappears into normalcy. And so America's lifelines carried forward, reinforced by stolen thought, while the story of the thinker faded into abstraction. The most unsettling question about Isaac Brown is not whether he existed. It is whether he was ever meant to be remembered. There is no evidence he tried to escape, no record of rebellion, no speeches, no attempts to claim recognition. Instead, there is preparation, encoded marks, distributed logic, ideas designed to survive without authorship. As if Isaac understood something devastatingly early, that demanding credit in a system built on denial would not preserve truth, but embedding truth into the physical world might. If that was his choice, then his silence was not weakness, it was strategy. He left no autobiography. He left no name carved into stone. He left systems that outlived the people who owned him. And perhaps that was the only form of authorship available to him. By the early 20th century, America was no longer a nation finding its footing. It was accelerating. Highways cut through land that once swallowed wagons whole. Massive water control projects reshaped rivers. Industrial zones expanded with confidence, as if failure had been engineered out of the system. Much of that confidence rested on inherited logic. Design principles refined long before formal credit systems existed. Techniques passed down without citation. Rules learned through practice, not publication. When projects like Hoover Dam rose in the 1930s, they were celebrated as triumphs of modern engineering, and they were. But beneath the equations and blueprints lay something older. An understanding of pressure, flow, and restraint that predated credentials. That understanding did not belong to one era. It belonged to people who learned by necessity, who observed failure because failure meant death, punishment, or loss. Isaac Brown did not design Hoover Dam, but the intellectual lineage that made such certainty possible had roots in minds like his. Invisible, unpaid, unnamed. Isaac's story unsettles because it did not end with emancipation. The pattern simply adapted. Credit followed access. Recognition followed power. Authorship followed permission. Throughout the 20th century, Black engineers and innovators were often placed in advisory roles, technical positions, or supporting capacities, their ideas absorbed into institutions that spoke with a single voice. The voice sounded neutral, professional, objective. But neutrality can be a mask. When innovation emerges from those denied ownership, systems learn to extract the result and discard the source. Infrastructure, again, proves perfect for this. You cannot point to a drainage angle and say who imagined it first. You cannot read a water pressure correction and see the hands that learned it through lived risk. So the pattern continues, not through overt cruelty, but through omission. And omission, repeated long enough, becomes tradition. To fully acknowledge Isaac Brown would require more than a plaque. It would require admitting that America's growth was not only fueled by labor, but by intellect it refused to recognize. That progress did not simply trickle down from educated elites, but rose up from people forbidden to be seen as thinkers. It would mean asking uncomfortable questions. How many systems rely on ideas whose origins were erased? How many innovations were discovered after being quietly practiced? How much brilliance survives today without permission to claim itself? Isaac's absence keeps those questions theoretical. His presence would make them unavoidable. Perhaps that is why his story remains unresolved. Every generation believes it has moved beyond the injustices of the last. And yet, the roads still carry us. The water still reaches us. The systems still serve us, quietly. Modern historians who stumble across Isaac Brown's traces face a dilemma. If they pursue the truth fully, they risk dismantling comforting narratives. If they ignore it, they become part of the silence that preserved the lie. There is no dramatic revelation waiting in an archive, no final document signed with his name, no moment where history confesses. Instead, there is only a pattern of brilliance emerging where it was forbidden, a pattern of ideas traveling farther than their creators, a pattern of nations benefiting while refusing to remember. Isaac Brown does not haunt America because of how he lived. He haunts it because of how easily he was absorbed and erased, and because that ease has never fully disappeared. If you stand today on a reinforced dock along the Gulf Coast, if you watch water drain cleanly from land that once drowned, if you move along routes stabilized long before modern surveying, you are standing inside a thought shaped by someone denied ownership of his own mind. History often asks us to remember heroes. This story asks something harder: to recognize that entire systems can be built without ever honoring the people who made them possible. Isaac Brown left no monument, but he left something more durable. He left function. And function, unlike memory, does not require permission to survive. The question is no longer whether he existed. The question is whether we are willing to admit how much of what sustains us was shaped by those we were taught not to see. If stories like this matter to you, stories history chose to forget, then this channel exists for you. Because the past doesn't disappear. It just hides inside what still works. If you believe forgotten minds deserve witness, subscribe to Past Without Witness. Like this video. It tells the algorithm this history matters. Share it, because silence is how stories vanish. And tell us in the comments, how many lives do you think were built into systems that never learned their names? We'll see you in the next story, where history left no witnesses, but left the evidence everywhere.